Hello everyone, I am Dark Tales, and I am here to help you. Today I know you need this video for a sleep. Before that, like the video and subscribe to Dark Tales, also where you from and what time you watching. Now get comfortable and relax. Let's start. The Haunting of Hill House. In the stillness of a cold autumn evening, Eleanor Vance, a woman who has lived most of her life in isolation, receives an invitation that will change everything. Her hands tremble as she reads the letter. The words inviting her to stay at a place she has only heard whispered about in dark corners of the world, Hill House. A mansion notorious for its strange reputation and its sinister past. With a hesitant breath, Eleanor realizes she has no choice but to go. Her life in the quiet suburbs feels stifling, and this invitation offers an escape, even if she doesn't fully understand why she feels compelled to go. As Eleanor prepares for her journey, her thoughts are clouded with uncertainty. She lives alone, burdened by the weight of caring for her ill mother, and feels the isolation pressing in on her. Hill House, with its dark reputation, draws her like a moth to a flame. But there's an unsettling sensation at the back of her mind. Something about the house feels off. Yet she can't help but feel a strange pull, as if the mansion itself is calling her, begging her to enter. Arriving at Hill House feels like stepping into another world. The tall iron gates, weathered by years of neglect, creak open as if welcoming her into its embrace. The house looms before her, towering and imposing, its windows like dark eyes, watching. The trees surrounding it stand like sentinels, blocking out the sky. The air feels heavier here, thick with the scent of damp wood and decay. As Eleanor steps closer, she senses that the house knows she's come, that it's been waiting for her. Her heart races, but something in her draws her forward. The door to Hill House opens, and Eleanor steps into the cold, dimly lit hallway. The house feels alive in its silence, as if it is breathing, waiting for her to uncover its secrets. She notices the peculiar design of the house, its twisted angles, rooms that seem to be placed in defiance of logic, hallways that lead nowhere, and doors that appear and disappear as if mocking her perception of reality. Every corner holds a secret. Every shadow seems to hide something just out of reach. The sound of footsteps behind her makes her turn quickly, but there's no one there. She swallows hard, brushing it off as nerves. She's alone, she reminds herself. No one else is here, and yet the air feels thick with an unseen presence. Eleanor's skin prickles as the silence stretches too long, and she begins to question if she's really alone after all. Dr. John Montague, the man who invited her, appears from the shadows. He's an odd figure, a man who clearly sees Hill House as an object of fascination rather than fear. He speaks of his research into the supernatural, and his eyes gleam with excitement. To him, Hill House is a scientific enigma, a place he believes holds the answers to questions about the unknown. But Eleanor doesn't share his enthusiasm. Something about his presence makes her uneasy, and she can't shake the feeling that he's not as open as he seems. As the evening unfolds, Eleanor meets Theodora, a woman with a mysterious aura whose beauty is matched only by her strange, unsettling behavior. Theodora, too, has been drawn to Hill House, but there's something about her that doesn't sit right with Eleanor. The way she speaks, the way she looks at Eleanor, it's as if she's hiding something, and the house seems to be pulling both of them closer together. That night, as the wind howls outside, Eleanor lays in her room, staring at the ceiling. The silence in the house is deafening, broken only by the creaks and groans of the old mansion. And then the whispering begins, faint at first, just a low murmur, as though the walls themselves are speaking to her. She sits up, heart racing, but there's no one in the room. The sound continues, growing louder now, almost as if it's calling her name. Eleanor! It's faint but unmistakable, her name spoken by a voice she cannot identify. The room feels colder, and Eleanor feels the weight of unseen eyes upon her. She stands, her legs unsteady, and approaches the door. But as she reaches for the handle, a sudden gust of wind slams it shut. She stumbles backward, her breath quickening, panic beginning to rise in her chest. She calls out for Theodora, but the house swallows her voice. It feels like the walls are closing in on her, pressing in from all sides. There is something deeply wrong here, something ancient, and the house itself is alive with a sinister intent. The night drags on, and Eleanor fights the urge to flee, but she cannot escape, not from the house, and not from herself. It feels as if the house is toying with her, leading her deeper into its labyrinth of dark corners and forgotten rooms. Every time she turns a corner, there's another unexpected sound, another whisper, another presence she can't explain. And every time, the fear tightens around her chest, making it harder to breathe. In the morning, as the first light of day barely filters through the windows, Eleanor tries to shake off the feeling of dread that clings to her. But it's no use. The house has already begun to work its way into her mind. She can feel it, its grip tightening, its influence creeping into her thoughts. As she meets Dr. Montague and Theodora for breakfast, she notices that both of them seem strangely unaware of the tension in the air. But Eleanor cannot ignore it. She knows deep down that Hill House is not just a building, it is a force. A force that wants her, that needs her to understand its terrible truth. The suspense builds as Eleanor's anxiety grows. She knows the house is waiting, but for what? What is Hill House hiding? What dark secrets does it hold that are slowly, relentlessly being revealed to her? And as she stands at the window, watching the wind stir the trees outside, she begins to wonder. Is the house haunted, or is she the one being haunted? And, more terrifying still, will she be able to leave before it claims her completely? The episode ends with Eleanor standing at the threshold of the house's darkest secret, unable to move forward or backward. The door behind her creaks open and she hears the whisper again, louder now, closer. Eleanor. The voice is no longer a murmur, it's a command. The suspense hangs in the air, thick as the shadows creeping along the floor, as the screen fades to black. As the morning light filters weakly through the thick curtains, Eleanor stands at the window, looking out over the sprawling, desolate grounds of Hill House. She can hear the wind rustling through the trees, their limbs swaying like ancient, gnarled fingers reaching for the sky. The sense of isolation is suffocating. Though she has only just arrived, something about it doesn't sit right, and yet she's drawn to it, compelled by an unseen force, as if the house is calling her to stay. Her thoughts drift back to the night before, to the whispers she'd heard in her room, faint but clear. Her name had been called. Eleanor. But by whom? There had been no one there. Her heart had raced as she tried to shake off the unsettling sensation, telling herself that it was just her mind playing tricks on her. Yet the fear had clung to her like a cold shadow, refusing to let go. After a restless night, Eleanor feels a strange mix of dread and anticipation. The house seems to hum with energy, a living thing breathing in the silence. She wonders if it's just her imagination, if she's simply exhausted from the long journey, but deep down, she knows it's not. There's something wrong here, something lurking in the darkness of Hill House. As she makes her way downstairs to meet Dr. Montague and Theodora for breakfast, she tries to ignore the tension that seems to thicken the air. Her footsteps echo on the creaky floors, the sound unnervingly loud in the otherwise still house. She can't shake the feeling that the walls themselves are watching her. She enters the dining room where Dr. Montague is already sitting, his face eager with excitement, as though the strange occurrences at Hill House are a puzzle he's eager to solve. Theodora is there too, her eyes wide, a faint smile playing on her lips, but her smile doesn't reach her eyes, which seem to dart around the room, never settling on one place for too long. Lena senses an unspoken tension between Theodora and Dr. Montague, an unease that neither of them acknowledges. Theodora, for all her beauty, seems fragile, almost ethereal, like someone caught between two worlds. But Eleanor can't quite understand why the woman's presence unsettles her so deeply. They talk over breakfast, but Eleanor finds it hard to focus on the conversation. Her thoughts are consumed by the house itself, its strange, oppressive energy, the inexplicable sounds that seem to follow her no matter where she goes. The house feels like a labyrinth, a place where time doesn't move in the usual way. One moment she feels like she's been here for weeks, the next it feels as though she's only just arrived. There's no rhyme or reason to the passage of time, just a slow, steady unraveling of her sense of reality. Later that morning, Dr. Montague invites Eleanor and Theodora to join him for a tour of the house. He speaks of the house with a strange reverence, as though it's an ancient artifact, something to be studied and understood. He mentions the history of Hill House, its former owners, the tragic deaths that have plagued its halls, and the rumours of the house's malevolent influence. But his words don't ease Eleanor's anxiety. If anything, they only serve to deepen the sense of dread that has been building within her since her arrival. As they move through the house, Eleanor is increasingly aware of the strange design. Rooms that seem to shift and change as they walk through them, hallways that seem to stretch on forever. The air grows colder with every step, and the house seems to close in around her, as though it's alive and watching her. Eleanor's heart pounds in her chest, the feeling of being trapped growing stronger with each passing moment. She looks at Theodora, but the other woman doesn't seem to share her concern. Theodora's smile is soft, almost knowing, as if she's already accepted that Hill House is not the place for the faint of heart. But Eleanor cannot shake the feeling that something is terribly wrong. She can hear the creak of the floorboards behind her, the sound of soft breathing that doesn't belong to any of them. She turns sharply, but there's nothing there. The silence that follows is oppressive, and for a moment, Eleanor wonders if she's losing her mind. She's alone in this house, completely alone, despite the presence of others. Dr. Montague leads them to a room at the end of the hallway, a room that Eleanor hasn't seen before. It's cold, even colder than the rest of the house, and the air feels thick, as though it's been sealed off from the rest of the world for years. The walls are lined with bookshelves, but the books seem old, their covers faded and brittle. The room is dimly lit, with a single flickering candle casting long shadows on the walls. As they step inside, the door slams shut behind them, and Eleanor jumps, her heart leaping into her throat. Dr. Montague chuckles nervously, but his laugh doesn't sound genuine. There's a hesitation in his voice, an unease that Eleanor can't ignore. Theodora, too, looks unsettled, though she tries to hide it behind a mask of nonchalance. Eleanor feels trapped, caught in the claustrophobic space of the room, her breath shallow and quick. The shadows seem to close in on them, moving like dark, living things. Dr. Montague begins speaking again, but Eleanor's attention is no longer on him. Her eyes are drawn to the corner of the room, where the shadows seem to twist and writhe. She blinks, thinking it's just the candlelight playing tricks on her, but when she looks again, the shadows are still there, moving, shifting. She can hear the faint whispering, low and guttural, almost too soft to make out, but it's there. And then she hears it. A voice, clear and unmistakable, calling her name. Eleanor. The sound sends a jolt of terror through her. She spins around, but no one is there. Dr. Montague is still speaking, unaware of her mounting panic, but Theodora's eyes widen, her lips parting as if she's heard something too. But she says nothing, and the moment passes. Eleanor can feel the cold sweat beading on her forehead, the hairs on the back of her neck standing on end. They leave the room, but the unease doesn't leave her. It follows her through the hallways, down the stairs, into every room they visit. The house seems to press in on her, the walls growing closer with each step. Eleanor feels like she's being pulled in every direction at once, unable to break free from the house's grip. And then, as she reaches the top of the stairs, she hears it again. The faint whispering, too soft to be real, yet it's unmistakably there. It's coming from behind her, from the very walls of the house. Eleanor. Her heart races, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She spins around, but there's no one there. The house is empty, silent once more. But Eleanor knows what she heard. The house is alive and is calling her name. And as the episode comes to a close, the camera lingers on her face, twisted in fear as the soft whispering grows louder, overwhelming her thoughts. She's not alone in Hill House. Not by a long shot. The morning light is dim, barely breaking through the thick, oppressive fog that has settled around Hill House. Eleanor feels the weight of the house pressing in on her chest, a suffocating pressure that grows stronger with every passing moment. The night's events have left her shaken. She can still hear the whispering in her ears, the soft, insistent call of her name even when she's alone. It's as though the house has embedded itself into her very soul, and she cannot escape its pull. She takes a deep breath, trying to steady herself as she stands in the hallway, her hand hovering over the door to the dining room. She doesn't know why she feels so reluctant to step inside, but she does. The quiet seems to grow louder, as if the house itself is holding its breath. She can feel something in the air, an energy, dark and electric, waiting to ignite. When she enters, Dr. Montague and Theodora are already seated at the table, but something is different. There's an unease in the air, a tension that wasn't there before. Theodora is staring at her with wide, haunted eyes, as though she's seen something unspeakable. Dr. Montague doesn't meet her gaze, his face pale, his lips pressed into a thin line of concentration. It's as if they're both aware of something she's not, something that's just beneath the surface of the ordinary, waiting to surface. Eleanor sits down, her stomach churning with a mixture of fear and curiosity. She tries to focus on the conversation, but it feels distant, as if the words are coming from a great distance. Her mind keeps drifting back to the strange occurrences of the past 2 days. The whispers, the cold spots, the way the walls seem to shift and move on their own. The house is a maze, not just in its physical layout, but in the way it messes with her mind, pulling her deeper into its grasp with every passing moment. Theodora's voice cuts through her thoughts, a sharp, cutting tone that sends a shiver down Eleanor's spine. "You don't feel it too, do you?" she asks, her eyes dark with something unspoken. "You haven't seen, heard things yet, not the way we have." Eleanor opens her mouth to respond, but the words catch in her throat. What can she say? How can she explain the fear that's beginning to eat away at her from the inside out? The house is more than just a building. It's a presence, a force of nature that's determined to make her its own. Dr. Montague interrupts, his voice low and almost reverent. "I've been studying Hill House for years," he says. "The energy here is unique, powerful. We're not just staying here, we're living in its history, its memory. And that memory is alive. It's aware of us, and it's waiting." The words send a chill down Eleanor's spine. Waiting? For what? And why is she here? She wasn't supposed to be part of whatever this is. She wasn't supposed to be caught in the web of Hill House's twisted history. But as much as she wants to turn away, she can't. She's drawn to it, a moth to the flame, helpless to resist its pull. The conversation drifts into silence, each of them lost in their own thoughts, their own fears. The minutes stretch out, slow and unbearable. The quiet is broken only by the occasional sound of a chair scraping against the floor, the creak of the house shifting as if it's settling deeper into itself. Eleanor feels her breath catch in her throat. There's something moving in the house, something that's aware of them, waiting for the right moment to strike. After breakfast, they decide to explore the house further. Dr. Montague is eager to document everything, to collect evidence of the strange occurrences he's been studying for years. Eleanor can't help but wonder why he's so intent on provoking whatever force is at work here. What does he hope to achieve? But she knows better than to question him. There's something obsessive in his demeanor, something that suggests he's already too far gone, too deep into Hill House's grip. They wander through the house, exploring rooms that feel increasingly unfamiliar, as if they've shifted since the last time they were there. The air grows heavier, thicker, and Eleanor feels as though she's walking through a dream or a nightmare. She's lost track of time, and she can't tell if it's been hours or mere minutes since they first stepped inside. The house seems to change before her eyes. The doors, once firmly shut, now creak open of their own accord. The floors groan underfoot, as though something is stirring beneath the surface, something ancient, buried in the house's foundations. Eleanor wants to scream, to run, but she can't. It's as if the very walls are holding her in place, trapping her in this suffocating labyrinth of darkness and fear. They come to a long, narrow corridor at the end of the house. It feels like a dead end, a place where no one is meant to go, but there is something compelling about it, something that draws Eleanor forward, her feet moving on their own, guided by an invisible force. The others are behind her, but their voices seem distant, as if they're no longer part of the same world. The house has swallowed them whole, and they're all alone now, trapped in its eerie embrace. Eleanor reaches the end of the corridor, where a single door stands slightly ajar. She can hear faint sounds coming from within, a soft rhythmic tapping like a heartbeat, pulsing in the dark. Her heart races, her pulse quickening with every step she takes toward the door. She doesn't want to open it, but her hand moves of its own accord, pushing the door open just enough to peer inside. What she sees sends a cold shock through her. The room is empty, save for a large ornate mirror that stands against the far wall. But the reflection isn't hers. In the mirror, she sees a woman, a figure dressed in tattered clothes, her face obscured by long, matted hair. The figure stands motionless, staring back at her with hollow eyes, as if waiting for her to make the next move. Eleanor's breath catches in her throat. She spins around, but there's no one there, nothing but the oppressive silence of Hill House. The tapping sound has stopped, and the mirror's empty once more, reflecting only her own image. But the sense of dread lingers, thick and suffocating. The house is watching her, and it knows her deepest fears. The others catch up to her, their faces drawn with anxiety, but Eleanor can't find the words to explain what she's seen. How can she? How can she explain the feeling that something is stalking her, following her every move, waiting for her to slip? The house is alive, and is becoming more insistent, more demanding with each passing moment. As the day wears on, the tension builds, thick and unrelenting. The house seems to stretch, its corridors winding and twisting, leading them further and further into its depths. They can't leave. They're trapped here, and the house knows it. The air grows heavier with each passing hour, as if the very walls are closing in, pressing them into a suffocating embrace. The night falls again, and the whispers return. Eleanor can hear them now, louder than before, echoing through the halls, growing closer with every step she takes. She turns a corner and sees it just for a moment, a flash of movement in the dark. A figure, standing in the doorway of one of the rooms. But when she blinks, it's gone. Her heart races as the whispers grow louder, now accompanied by the sound of footsteps behind her. She can't escape it. The house is alive and it's closing in. The episode ends with Eleanor standing frozen in the hallway, the whispers growing to a deafening roar as the camera slowly pulls back, leaving her alone in the dark, her face twisted in terror. The door slams shut and the screen cuts to black. The suspense lingers, leaving the audience on edge, waiting for the next piece of the haunting puzzle to fall into place. The night that followed felt longer than any Eleanor had ever experienced. Every corner of Hill House seemed to whisper in the silence, murmurs of things she couldn't fully understand, things that tugged at her very being. The air was thick with an unseen presence, and Eleanor felt herself drawn deeper into the house's clutches with every step she took. Even in the dead of night, she could not escape the feeling that something or someone was watching her, waiting. Eleanor sat on the edge of her bed, staring out the small window that overlooked the garden. The moonlight filtered through the mist, casting eerie shadows across the lawn. She was alone in her room, or at least she thought she was. The stillness was interrupted only by the creaking of the house, its groans and sighs as though it was alive, stretching and shifting in its own time. She could feel her heart pounding, a constant reminder of the tension that coiled around her chest, suffocating her. The sound of a door creaking open in the hallway caught her attention. She froze. She wasn't sure if it was real or if the house was playing tricks on her mind, but she couldn't ignore the dread pooling in her stomach. Her instincts screamed at her to stay put, to pretend she hadn't heard it, but she couldn't. Slowly, cautiously, she crept out of bed and moved toward the door. The hallway was empty when she peeked out. The house was unnervingly quiet. But there was something about the silence that was worse than any noise could be, as though the house was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Then, without warning, a loud thud echoed from somewhere deeper in the house. Eleanor flinched and stumbled backward, her hand pressed against the wall for support. Her breath was shallow, her pulse quickening as she tried to make sense of the sound. It had come from the farthest part of the house, the attic. But why would there be a noise from there? There was nothing up there, at least nothing living. Dr. Montague had warned them about the house's ability to play with the mind, but this felt different. This felt as though the house was trying to pull her into its deepest recesses, into the heart of its long-buried secrets. As she made her way down the hallway, her steps felt heavier, as though the very air around her had thickened. The cold seemed to have seeped into her bones, numbing her from the inside out. She tried to tell herself it was just her imagination, but the deep sense of foreboding grew, pushing her forward, pulling her closer to whatever awaited her at the end of the hall. The door to the attic creaked open with a groan of protest. Eleanor's eyes widened as she stepped inside, the dim light from the hallway casting strange shadows across the room. The attic was as she remembered it, cold, dusty, and empty except for old furniture and long-forgotten relics. The air felt heavier here, the temperature dropping even further, and Eleanor instinctively pulled her coat tighter around her. Then she saw it, a figure, a silhouette in the farthest corner of the room. It was standing completely still, its back to her. Eleanor couldn't make out its features, but she knew it wasn't one of the others. The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end, a wave of icy fear sweeping through her body. She opened her mouth to call out, but no sound came. The figure turned slowly, deliberately, as though it had been waiting for her all this time. Its face was obscured by shadows, but there was something about its presence that made Eleanor's blood run cold. The air seemed to freeze in the room, the silence stretching out between them like an eternity. Eleanor couldn't move, her feet frozen to the spot. Then In a voice so soft, so almost imperceptible, the figure spoke, its words cutting through the silence like a blade. "You shouldn't be here." Eleanor's heart slammed against her chest. Every instinct told her to run, to escape, but her body refused to obey. The figure took a step forward, and Eleanor felt her breath catch in her throat as the darkness in the attic seemed to close in on her. She tried to take a step back, but her legs wouldn't move. Before she could react, the figure vanished, melting into the shadows as if it had never been there. Eleanor gasped for air, her chest tight as she stumbled backward, nearly falling over. The attic was empty now, completely, eerily still, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her just out of sight, waiting. As she fled from the attic, the house seemed to groan around her. The walls shifted, the floors creaked beneath her feet, and the air grew thick with a sense of dread. She rushed back to her room, locking the door behind her, but it did nothing to ease the terror that gripped her. She lay in bed, wide awake, every sound amplified in the silence. The whispers returned, soft at first, but then louder, more insistent. Her name echoed in her ears, a call from the darkness. The next morning, the house seemed almost too quiet. Dr. Montague and Theodora were nowhere to be found, and Eleanor was left alone in the house once more. She wandered through the halls, her footsteps echoing in the stillness. The rooms seemed to stretch on forever, the walls closing in as she made her way through the maze of corridors. The house felt more alive than ever, its presence pressing down on her, suffocating her. She came across Dr. Montague's study, and for a moment she felt a flicker of hope. If anyone could explain what was happening, it was him. But when she entered the room, she found it empty. The desk was cluttered with papers, but there was no sign of the man himself. The chair at the desk was tipped over, the papers scattered across the floor as though someone had left in a hurry. Eleanor's heart skipped a beat as she stepped closer, her eyes scanning the room. There was something off about the way the desk had been left in such disarray. She moved toward the window, glancing out at the misty garden below, and that's when she saw it. A figure standing in the distance, its face hidden in the shadows. The figure was standing still, watching her. Her breath hitched in her throat as she turned quickly, running down the hallway, her feet pounding against the floor. The house seemed to close in around her, its walls pressing inward, the air thick and suffocating. She felt as though she was being swallowed whole. The whispers returned, louder now, more frantic. Her heart raced as she stumbled into one of the hallways and turned a corner, only to find herself face to face with Dr. Montague. His eyes wide with fear. He grabbed her by the shoulders, his voice trembling. "We have to leave," he said. "Now! It's not safe here, we're trapped." But it was already too late. The walls seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy, and the house groaned as though it was coming alive, its ancient spirit stirring once more. Eleanor felt her breath catch in her throat as the temperature dropped, her skin prickling with cold. The house was no longer just a house. It was something else, something alive, and it was closing in on them. In a final, desperate attempt to escape, Eleanor tried to run, but the house had other plans. The door to the outside was slammed shut, and the walls seemed to move, shifting in ways she couldn't understand. She could hear Dr. Montague's voice calling her, but it was drowned out by the rising crescendo of the whispers, the relentless force of the house pulling her into its depths. As the camera pulled back, Eleanor's face was twisted in terror, her body shaking, trapped in the clutches of Hill House. The whispers were deafening now, the suspense building to a terrifying climax as the episode ended in complete darkness, leaving the audience on edge, desperate to know what would happen next. The house was a labyrinth of shifting shadows, each corner more mysterious and foreboding than the last. Eleanor could feel the walls pressing in around her, the air heavy with an oppressive sense of dread. She was no longer sure if it was her mind playing tricks on her, or if the house itself had taken on a life of its own, feeding off her fear, growing stronger with each passing moment. Every creak, every groan, every whisper sent a shiver through her spine. She was trapped, and there was no escaping its pull. As Eleanor ventured deeper into the heart of Hill House, she found herself drawn to the parlor, the room that had been the center of so much strange activity. The large windows offered a view of the sprawling garden, the mist curling over the grass like some ancient serpent. Yet it was the shadows that caught her attention. Shadows that didn't seem to belong, shadows that moved when no one was near. Her footsteps were muffled against the thick carpet, her eyes darting around the room. She could feel a presence, though it was impossible to identify. Something ancient and anciently powerful lingering in the air. Her breath quickened as the temperature in the room seemed to plummet, the chill biting at her skin. She moved toward the fireplace, her gaze locked on the empty chairs around the room, as if waiting for someone, or something, to sit. Suddenly, a loud crash broke the stillness. Eleanor jumped, her heart leaping in her chest. The noise had come from upstairs, a heavy thud, followed by the unmistakable sound of something or someone scraping across the floor. Without thinking, she sprinted toward the staircase, the floorboards creaking beneath her frantic pace. She didn't want to go up there, but some force, an invisible hand, was pushing her forward. She reached the top of the stairs and hesitated, her eyes scanning the long hallway before her. It was dark, too dark. The shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally, as if the darkness itself had a weight. Her pulse hammered in her ears as she slowly moved forward, each step more tentative than the last. The scraping sound was closer now, almost as if it were following her. She stopped in her tracks, her breath held in her chest. It was coming from the farthest room, the one she had always avoided. The door to the room creaked open of its own accord, the hinges groaning in protest. Eleanor felt her stomach tighten. She knew she shouldn't go in, but the compulsion was too strong. She crossed the threshold into the room, her footsteps muffled by the thick carpeting. The room was vast, dimly lit by the pale glow of the moon filtering through the dust-choked windows. As she moved deeper into the room, a sense of vertigo washed over her. The walls seemed to tilt, the ceiling looming overhead like a distant, unreachable sky. Then she saw it. At the far corner of the room, a small figure hunched in the darkness. Eleanor couldn't make out any details, but she could feel its presence, a chilling weight in the air. She stepped forward, her heart thudding in her chest, her body frozen in place as though her feet were stuck to the floor. The figure turned slowly, deliberately, and Eleanor gasped, her blood running cold. It was a child, or at least it appeared to be, but its face was a mask of hollow emptiness, its eyes two dark pits of despair. It tilted its head at her, its gaze never wavering, as if waiting for something, waiting for her to do something, anything. "Leave this place," the child whispered, its voice barely audible above the sound of Eleanor's racing heartbeat. Eleanor took a step back, her legs trembling. The room felt like it was closing in on her, the air thick and suffocating. She turned to leave, but the door slammed shut with a deafening crash, trapping her inside. The figure in the corner of the room shifted, rising to its feet, its movements jerky, unnatural. Eleanor's breath hitched in her throat as the child began to move toward her, its slow, deliberate steps echoing in the silence. Every step felt like an eternity, each one inching her closer to the abyss. "Get out!" The voice was louder now, a command rather than a plea. The child reached out with a long skeletal hand, its fingers curling toward Eleanor's arm, its touch cold as ice. Eleanor recoiled, her heart racing, but her feet remained rooted to the spot. She couldn't move, couldn't scream, as if the very air in the room had thickened around her, suffocating her every movement. The child's face twisted into a grotesque grin, its eyes glowing with an unearthly light. Eleanor felt a wave of nausea roll through her, her body trembling in terror as the walls around her seemed to close in tighter and tighter. The child's smile grew wider, its laughter echoing in the room, growing louder and louder until it became a maddening cacophony. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, everything stopped. The child vanished, disappearing into the shadows without a trace. The room fell silent once more, the oppressive weight lifting, but the sense of dread remained. Eleanor stumbled backward, her mind reeling. She reached for the door, her hands shaking as she fumbled for the handle. It opened easily this time, and she rushed out into the hallway, gasping for air. As she ran down the stairs, she could feel the house around her shifting, its very foundation groaning in protest. The walls seemed to close in, each room more oppressive than the last. She had to get out, had to escape before it consumed her entirely. But it was too late. She stopped dead in her tracks as a figure stepped out from the shadows at the bottom of the staircase. Dr. Montague. His face was pale, his eyes wide with fear, and his hands were trembling as he reached out toward her. "We have to leave. Now!" "It's all true, Eleanor, everything," he said, his voice shaking. But before Eleanor could respond, a loud crash echoed from the far side of the house, the sound of something breaking, of something crashing to the ground. Dr. Montague flinched, his eyes darting toward the noise. "Not now," he hissed. "We need to go, now." The house seemed to respond to his words, the air growing thicker, colder. A low growling noise emanated from deep within the walls, and Eleanor could feel the presence of something ancient, powerful and malicious, moving closer. She felt her breath quicken as the shadows seemed to reach out toward her, as if trying to pull her back into the heart of the house. Without warning, the lights flickered, casting the entire hallway into darkness. Eleanor screamed, the sound of her voice swallowed by the overwhelming silence. The growling sound intensified, vibrating through the walls, shaking the very foundation of Hill House. The temperature plummeted, and Eleanor could see her breath mist in the air. Dr. Montague grabbed her arm, pulling her toward the front door. But as they neared it, a figure appeared in the doorway. It was a woman, her face pale and twisted, her eyes wide with terror as she screamed at them to stop. "Don't go outside," she cried. "You have no idea what you're dealing with." Eleanor stopped dead, her heart racing in her chest. The figure's face was contorted in fear, her hands reaching out toward them in a desperate plea. But before Eleanor could speak, the woman disappeared into the shadows, her scream echoing through the hall as if the house itself had swallowed her whole. And then, just as quickly as it had all begun, the house went silent again. The suspense hung in the air like a thick fog. Every sound amplified, every moment stretched to its breaking point. The darkness was closing in, and Eleanor knew that they were running out of time. Something was coming for them, and there was no way to escape. The house was alive, and it was hungry. The wind howled through the cracks of Hill House, its eerie whistle a constant reminder that something unnatural lurked within its walls. Eleanor stood frozen in the center of the dimly lit hallway, her heart pounding so loudly it threatened to drown out the sounds of the house around her. Each floorboard creaked beneath her feet as she hesitated, not sure if she was still alone or if the walls themselves were closing in on her. Every instinct screamed for her to run, but her feet felt like they were glued to the ground. The air was thick with a stifling heaviness that weighed down on her chest, making it hard to breathe. The shadows seemed to pulse with a life of their own, stretching and shifting unnaturally, as if they were aware of her every movement. She tried to move forward, but her body refused to obey, paralyzed by the fear that had taken hold of her. It was as if the house itself was playing with her, toying with her mind, distorting reality with each passing moment. Suddenly, there was a noise, a soft, deliberate scratching sound like nails dragging across wood. Eleanor spun around, her heart leaping in her chest. The hallway behind her was empty, but the sound continued, growing louder with each passing second. She pressed herself against the wall, trying to steady her breath, but her hands were shaking uncontrollably. The scratching came again, this time followed by a low, guttural growl that sent a chill racing down her spine. With a burst of adrenaline, Eleanor bolted forward, rushing toward the stairs, her footsteps echoing in the silence. She needed to get out. She didn't care where, she just had to escape the suffocating grasp of Hill House. But as she reached the foot of the staircase, something stopped her, a shadow, flickering in the corner of her vision, too quick to catch fully but impossible to ignore. It darted across the landing, vanishing into the darkness above. Eleanor's breath hitched. She wasn't alone. A distant, haunting sound broke through the tension. A cry, thin and ragged, as if someone was in pain. Eleanor's mind raced. Was it one of the others? Was it Dr. Montague? She couldn't remember when they had last spoken, but she had a sinking feeling deep in her gut that the house had taken them, one by one, and she was next. The house groaned as if it were alive, its walls shifting, creaking in response to the terror that seemed to linger in the air. Eleanor slowly turned to face the staircase, dread sinking in her stomach. The door to the room at the end of the hall was wide open now, though she was certain it had been closed earlier. She had been drawn to that room since the moment she had set foot in the house, but it was as if something inside it was waiting for her, calling to her, pulling her closer with invisible threads. Shaking, she made her way to the room, her steps slow and hesitant. The room was cold, far colder than it had been the last time she entered. A strange, almost electric charge seemed to hang in the air, and she felt a chill crawl across her skin as she stepped over the threshold. The moonlight filtered through the dirty windows, casting eerie shadows across the room, and everything seemed wrong. The furniture was out of place, the chairs scattered across the floor in a disorganized mess. The entire space felt as though it had been abandoned in haste, as if something terrible had happened in this very spot. Her eyes darted around the room, seeking any sign of movement, any clue as to what had occurred. The walls were adorned with faded, peeling wallpaper, and in the corner there was an old grandfather clock. The pendulum swung lazily, its ticking loud in the quiet room, as if it were counting down to something inevitable. Then she saw it. A figure standing at the far wall, its back to her, its silhouette faint in the dim light. Eleanor froze, her blood running cold. She couldn't move, couldn't breathe. As the figure turned slowly, its face obscured in shadow. It was humanoid, but its features were wrong, twisted, as if the house itself had distorted them. The figure's eyes gleamed with an unnatural intensity, its gaze fixed on her with an unsettling stillness. It smiled. A slow, deliberate grin spread across its face, stretching wider and wider until it became grotesque. The sound of its breathing was labored, as if it were struggling to draw air into its lungs. But the smile never faltered, its eerie presence consuming every inch of the room. Eleanor's pulse raced as her body screamed for her to run, but her feet remained rooted to the floor, her muscles refusing to obey. The air felt thick, suffocating, as if the room itself was pressing in on her, closing her off from the rest of the world. Her vision blurred as she struggled to focus on the figure before her, the tension in the room becoming unbearable. Then the figure moved. He took a single step toward her, its movements jerky and unnatural, as though it were struggling against some invisible force. With each step, Eleanor could feel the walls tremble, a low, deep rumble emanating from the very heart of the house. She could hear it now, whispers, faint but growing louder, as if the house was speaking to her, urging her to stay, to listen, to obey. "Leave now," the voice murmured, soft but commanding, laced with a venomous sweetness that sent chills down her spine. The figure's hand stretched toward her, its fingers elongated, thin and skeletal. Eleanor's throat tightened, the fear choking her as she took a step backward, her heart pounding in her chest. The shadows around her seemed to grow deeper, darker, the edges of the room fading away into an impenetrable blackness. She could feel the presence of something else, something even darker than the figure itself, a force that seemed to press in on her from all sides. The whispers grew louder, more urgent, more insistent. "Don't go. Don't leave. Stay with us." Eleanor tried to scream, but no sound escaped her lips. Her body felt like stone, her muscles locked in place as the figure's hand inched closer, its fingers brushing against her skin. The coldness of its touch seared her flesh, like ice running through her veins, freezing her in place. She felt herself pulled toward it, the house's grip tightening around her, its unseen force dragging her closer to the figure. In a last-ditch effort to break free, Eleanor tore herself away from the figure, her legs trembling beneath her as she stumbled backward, her breath ragged and shallow. She turned and bolted for the door, but before she could reach it, the room shifted, twisting in on itself. The walls closed in, the windows disappearing into blackness. She was trapped. Her pulse quickened as the shadows closed in around her. She could hear the figure's voice again, its whispers like a dark lullaby, singing her closer to madness. "You belong to us, forever." The walls shook violently, the entire house groaning as though in pain, the noise deafening. Eleanor's vision blurred as the room seemed to collapse, and she was no longer sure what was real. She felt herself falling, plummeting into darkness, her body weightless as the floor beneath her gave way. And then, all at once, the house went silent. Eleanor gasped for air, her chest heaving as she opened her eyes. She was lying on the floor of the parlor, the room completely still. The shadows had lifted, the whispers gone. For a moment she wondered if it had all been a dream, a hallucination brought on by the house's twisted power. But as she stood and looked around, the sense of dread remained, thick and suffocating. She wasn't safe, not by a long shot. The house had won, but it wasn't done with her yet. Eleanor's eyes fluttered open as the first rays of dawn crept through the cracks of the drawn curtains, casting a faint light over the room. But there was no comfort in the soft glow. The air felt heavier now, more oppressive than before. She could feel the weight of Hill House pressing down on her, like an invisible force, suffocating the life out of everything it touched. She lay motionless for a moment, listening to the unsettling silence, her heart hammering in her chest. The events of the previous night felt like a blur, a nightmare she couldn't shake off, but the dread still lingered, clinging to her like a shadow. There was something wrong about the house, something deeply wrong. Eleanor could feel it in the very walls, in the floors that creaked beneath her, in the air that tasted thick and stale. The house was watching her, listening to her, waiting. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind that rattled the windows, every strange shift of the shadows, every single sound felt like a warning, a sign that it was coming for her, and she couldn't escape. No one could. Her body trembled as she sat up, slowly, her eyes scanning the room, searching for any sign of movement, any flicker of danger. The room appeared ordinary enough, nothing out of place. Yet she couldn't shake the sensation that something was watching her from the corners of the space. Her pulse quickened as she stood and moved toward the window, pulling back the heavy curtains to reveal the overgrown garden outside. The sun was rising, but there was no warmth in its light. The garden was twisted, neglected, as though it had been abandoned for years. She looked down at the distant gates. knowing they were locked. The only way in or out of Hill House was through the darkened halls and rooms that she'd come to fear. There was no escaping the house, no matter how far she ran. Suddenly, a voice broke the silence. Soft at first, barely a whisper, but unmistakable. Eleanor. Her heart skipped a beat. It was her name, clear and cold, spoken with an unnatural calmness. She whipped around, scanning the room, but there was no one there. The house was empty, wasn't it? Yet the voice lingered, as though it come from the walls themselves. It was a whisper that seemed to seep into her very bones, chilling her from the inside out. "Eleanor!" It came again, this time louder, more insistent, and the sound seemed to fill the entire room. Her throat tightened. She backed away from the window, her legs unsteady, her eyes wide with fear. She wanted to scream, but the words were trapped in her chest, swallowed by the oppressive atmosphere that clung to her every step. The whispering voice had no source. It was all around her, in the air, in the floorboards beneath her feet, in the very walls that enclosed her. A sudden bang echoed through the house, followed by another, then another. The sound of something heavy being dragged across the floor, the unmistakable sound of furniture scraping violently against the wooden floor. Eleanor's heart raced as she spun around, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She had to get out of there, she had to leave, but as she moved toward the door, it slammed shut with a deafening crash. The sound rang in her ears, reverberating through her skull. She pressed her palms against the door, her fingers trembling as she tried to push it open, but it wouldn't budge. It was as if the house itself had locked her in, trapping her like an animal in a cage. The whispers started again, this time coming from the far corner of the room. Eleanor froze, her body rigid with fear. She couldn't see anyone, couldn't see anything, but the voices were growing louder, multiplying, surrounding her. They were like a swarm of angry bees, buzzing in her ears, each word more incomprehensible than the last. She couldn't make sense of them, couldn't even hear them individually, but one thing was clear. The house was alive, and it was speaking to her. Then a shadow moved across the room, fast and silent, too quick to catch fully. Lily's breath caught in her throat as she turned, her heart pounding wildly. She was no longer alone. Something, or someone, was in the room with her. She squinted into the darkness, her vision straining to pick out any shape, any movement, and then she saw it. A figure crouched in the corner, hidden in the deepest shadows. It was small, its features obscured by the darkness, but there was no mistaking the outline. It was human, or at least it had once been. Eleanor's skin prickled with dread as she took a hesitant step forward, her eyes locked on the figure, unable to tear herself away. Suddenly it moved. The figure darted toward her with unnatural speed, and Eleanor stumbled backward in panic. She slammed into the door, her breath ragged, her vision swimming with terror. The figure stopped inches from her, its face hidden beneath a veil of dark, matted hair. Its hands were outstretched, reaching for her, fingers curling as though they were desperate to touch her. Eleanor screamed, the sound escaping her throat like a wild animal's cry, but before she could move, the figure stepped back into the shadows, disappearing as quickly as it had appeared. The room was silent once again, the air thick with tension. Eleanor's mind raced, her body trembling as she tried to process what had just happened. Had she seen it? Had it been real? The door creaked open behind her. Eleanor spun around, her heart thundering in her chest. There was no one there, no sign of anyone or anything, just the empty hallway stretching into darkness. She took a step forward, her body refusing to move with any confidence. But the silence was broken once more, this time by a low, guttural growl, as if the house itself were hungry. Her breath caught in her throat, and she turned slowly, unable to stop herself. The growl came again, louder, more insistent, as if the walls of the house were alive, urging her to do something, anything but stay. It was a deep, resonating sound that came from the very bowels of Hill House, filling every inch of space, as if the house had taken on a voice of its own. With every passing second, Eleanor could feel the air grow thicker, the house pressing in on her, its walls seemingly bending closer with every breath. She felt the weight of its gaze, felt the overwhelming presence of something ancient, something that had been waiting for her, waiting for all of them. Her eyes flickered to the window again, and for the briefest moment she thought she saw something in the distance, a figure, standing still and watching just outside the gate. It was too far away to make out, but it felt like the weight of the gaze reached out, grabbing her by the heart. Her feet moved on their own, slowly, cautiously, toward the window. She pulled the curtain aside again, but when she looked out, there was nothing there. The silence in the house was suffocating now. The whispers were gone, the growls silenced, and yet Eleanor could feel something stirring beneath the stillness, something waiting for her to make a mistake. And then she heard it, a voice, low, distorted and chilling, echoing through the air. "It's too late, Eleanor. You've already seen it." She froze, paralyzed by the realization that there was no escaping, no way out. The house had marked her, claimed her. She was a part of it now, and there was no escaping Hill House. The doors slammed shut, the windows rattled, and for a moment, everything went dark.